Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Progressive Forum. We're the world's only expressly progressive lecture series, and we're based in Houston, Texas. I'm Randall Morton, founder of the Progressive Forum. I'm excited my guest today is world-renowned theoretical physicist Brian Greene. He's making his second appearance at the Progressive Forum. He sold out our Opera House, the Wortham Center, in his first appearance. Immediately after our talk, this presentation will be available on our website on this page, open-endedly, for educational enrichment and to share with your friends. Please sign up to get announcements for future events and make a donation if you wish. These live stream events are free, so we can reach a national and worldwide audience with our progressive and educational messages. I thank our event sponsor, John M. Blocker, for his generosity for making this event possible. Mike Blocker is a longtime fan of Brian Greene, who's read all his books. Thank you, Mike, for helping us share your passion. We estimate today's online event will produce 1 ton of carbon. The Progressive Forum has made a donation for this ton to the Texas Coastal Exchange, which sequesters carbon and protects marshland. Brian Greene and I will be discussing his important new book, Until the End of Time, Mind, Matter, and Our Search for Meaning in an Evolving Universe. For the next 2 weeks, you can purchase a copy at a discount, and the book comes with a special Progressive Forum bookplate signed by Brian Greene. Just click the purchase link under the screen, and our friends at Houston's Blue Willow Bookshop will send you a copy. Brian Greene is known for his groundbreaking theories of superstring theory to explain the fundamental forces of nature and the cosmos. His books have included The Elegant Universe, The Fabric of the Cosmos, and The Hidden Reality, which have collectively spent 65 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Today's book, Until the End of Time, takes the reader on an epic journey from the beginning of the cosmos to the end, elucidating theories on the emergence of cells, life, and a human mind that needs to tell stories. He focuses on the ultimate question: in a different universe that's going to end, what matters? How do we find personal meaning? Professor Greene, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's good to see you again. Thanks for being with us, and congratulations on this amazing book.
Thank you.
Let's dive right into your book. As I mentioned, your book takes us from the beginning to the end of the universe, including the end of Earth and life. This is distressing. Your book asks, quote, "Where then does that leave us?" Where does that leave us?
Well, it's a big question, and one that, to understand the full answer, I think we'll have to back up a little bit at some point. But just to give the gist of my perspective, when you realize that everything that you care about, from anything on this planet, anything created on this planet, to our sun, to the other planets, to any structure that you see on a beautiful night sky, when you realize that all of that is going to disintegrate, it's going to fall apart. When you realize that, it focuses your attention on the utterly special, utterly wondrous moment in the cosmological sense through which we're living. There's a brief moment on the cosmic timeline when collections of particles can coalesce into creatures that can think and feel and look around and ask these kinds of questions. And that, to me, is where the beauty and the gratification and the reverence for being alive at all comes from. That recognition, which I think becomes most startling when you see it within this grand landscape of time beginning to end.
I like your word gratification. You say impermanence is the foundation of gratitude. Could you reflect on impermanence and what that does for you?
Well, I can talk both at a personal level and at a species wide level. I mean, we as a people, as a species, have long since valued permanence. We talk about etching things in stone. We talk about legacy for the future. And I think that comes down to our singular recognition of our own finitude, of our own mortality. I mean, there's a beautiful book that had a deep influence on me personally when I read it, a book by Ernest Becker called The Denial of Death. It won the Pulitzer Prize back in the 70s. Not that many people know about that book today.
I do.
You do. That's great. And that book opened my eyes to the fact that so much of what we do and so much of what we care about is in response to our understanding of how limited, how finite our lives actually are. And so when you take that into account, you recognize that it is in response to the fundamental impermanence of everything that we are driven to do so much of what we do. And of course, as individuals, we recognize that impermanence in many ways. Look, I lost my dad. I was fortunate to have him for 23 years, but I lost him at a relatively young age. He was a young man. I lost my mom in June from the virus, and these moments, these life moments that we all go through in one way or another. And I thank the heavens that be that I am alive to have witnessed the death of my parents, because the reverse would have been tragic. That would have been awful for them. I mean, the worst thing you can imagine for a parent is to lose a child. So I'm thankful that I'm able to experience and mourn the death of my own parents, but it is a wrenching experience. And it is one that, again, just hammers home this recognition of how fragile and how finite we are.
What's your advice for those of us feeling a little stuck as far as meaning and purpose? For me, finding one's natural elements, talents, for example, feels like a source of meaning and purpose. What's your advice for adding meaning and purpose to life?
Well, I think it is a highly individualistic, highly personal journey and question that each one of us needs to answer in one form or another. And for some, and I think my view is similar to yours, finding activities in the world that you feel good at, that you feel respected for, that you feel make some kind of difference to the world in some way, shape, or form, that can give you a sense of meaning and purpose. For others, there are different metrics. Look, there's some who the number of digits in the balance in the bank account is where that sense of meaning and purpose comes from, right? For some, it's power. Mm-hmm. Ascending to the positions in the world where you can call the shots. That's where that sense of meaning comes from. So I don't think there's any one answer, but what I would say, we're emerging hopefully from a very unusual stretch of time in which so many of us have had to think about issues in a different way, think about our lives in a different way, struggle with loss, unexpected, tragic loss. And my feeling is that when you recognize that there is a universality that does connect us, I mean, sure, you can talk about, the brotherhood and the sisterhood of mankind or humankind, but I'm speaking actually at the level of fundamental physics, that we're all made of the same stuff, literally. We're all collections of particles governed by the laws of physics. That's all that we are. And when you recognize that, it connects us together. And moreover, it makes it so clear at how miraculous it is that collections of particles can think and feel and wonder about purpose and grieve and mourn and thrill. And when you recognize that that is really what makes us human, that we're collections of particles that are organized in just the right way to allow us to do those things, to me, it makes you feel less alone. Mm-hmm. It makes you feel part of a collective. And within that, I think one can feel a sense of value just by virtue of participating in that unfolding.
Let's get into the physics. One of your endeavors over 30 years has been developing superstring theory to explain fundamental forces of the cosmos and nature. String theory is supposed to resolve tensions between Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. What are we learning from string theory? And is the math working out?
Well, we're learning that trying to answer the deep laws and the deep questions and the deep mysteries is a journey. It's a journey that doesn't happen quickly. I mean, when I was a graduate student back in the dark ages in the 1980s, there was a sense among physicists that the end of physics was near. People seriously were saying things like that, and there was a sense that if you weren't working on string theory, you were making the wrong decision, because here the final theory was at hand. Now, the more seasoned researchers, the older, more mature physicists, knew that that was likely not to be the case, and that it would be many decades, even centuries of hard work. And certainly the last 30 years have emphasized that point in particular. So is the math working out? I would say that in some elements, it has spectacularly worked out. We've gained insight into the nature of black holes. We've gained insight, perhaps work that's happening right now, into the very nature of space itself, linkages to quantum physics that are really mind-bogglingly exciting. But if you ask me, what about the evidence? Has this theory made contact with observations and experiments? Has it made a prediction at the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland, that has been borne out through the analysis? I have to say no, not yet. So when I was a graduate student, I would have hoped that by now we would have had that experimental connection. That has not yet worked out. But in other domains, the more abstract domains of black holes and singularities in the nature of space, I'd say we're further along than I would have guessed back in the early days of my graduate education.
Parts of your book are poetic, like your description of math as romantic. You relate a story about Albert Einstein, who had heart palpitations on the verge of completing his math on relativity. You say, quote, "Through mathematics, we are given leave to commune with a strange and wondrous cosmos," unquote. Why math? Why equations? How do you reflect that symbols can explain a universe?
Yeah, that is a bit of a mystery. How can these little squiggles that we scratch out on paper, on blackboards, how can that actually tell us about the world? There's actually a famous paper by Eugene Wigner, a famous physicist, called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. Why is math so good, right? And one answer to that, I don't know if it's a full answer, but it satisfies me at least to some extent. I consider math to be a language. It's the language that's particularly well suited to encapsulating patterns and using those patterns to predict other members of the pattern, things that will happen subsequently. And what we as human beings do, I view us as pattern recognition machines, biological pattern recognition machines. We look out at the world, and in order to survive, it's very useful to be able to predict what's going to happen next, or at least have a sense of what's around the bend or what's going to happen tomorrow. So through evolution, we've become really good at spotting the patterns. We develop a language called mathematics, which is really good at articulating those patterns. And then our evolved brain goes beyond mere survival and applies the very same template to understand things that don't matter to survival. I mean, it doesn't matter if we understand black holes, right? It doesn't matter if we understand electrons and quarks. We could survive without that. Many people happily live without that knowledge. But our brain is able to go beyond mere survival and apply those techniques to those unfamiliar realms. And because those realms themselves have inbuilt patterns, the universe is lawful. Why that is a good question. I can't really answer that, but it appears that the universe is lawful, which means that the universe does abide by patterns, and math is the very language that we invented for describing those patterns. So that, to me, is where the link comes from.
I was amazed to learn that the static between TV stations in the old television sets in the 60s is the microwave background left over from the Big Bang. Is that also true from the static on my portable radio? And am I really experiencing something that's 13 billion years old? How can we think about this leftover background from the Big Bang?
Yeah, no, it is a sort of an amazing fact. It's not all of the static, but a small percent of that static indeed does come from heat left over from the Big Bang. And it also depends exactly what channel you tune on the television, the old style, to maximize the signal. But yeah, it is the case, because the Big Bang was an era in the universe where the environment was ferociously hot. And as the universe expanded, that heat was diluted. It was now spread out among a larger environment. So things cooled down. But they didn't cool down all the way to zero. They just cooled down to a couple degrees above absolute zero. And so that heat is still with us. It permeates all of space. It permeates all of space everywhere. And that heat is, in essence, just photons left over from the Big Bang. And if you have a receiver, that receiver can capture some of those Big Bang photons. And indeed, that's what the static is. And so more generally, we study that static. We study that microwave background radiation because it is a kind of indelible signature of what the universe had to have been like in its earliest moments to yield the very specific patterns in that static that we can measure today. So we measure the temperature in that static, the temperature in the background radiation in the night sky. We send up incredibly accurate thermometers, in essence, that measure the temperature of space. And it varies from one point in the sky to another by a tiny amount, by 1 part in 10,000, 1 part in 100,000. But those tiny temperature differences, we believe, reflect the processes of quantum physics as they played out in the earliest moments of the universe. So that allows us to link our theoretical understanding to our observations that we can undertake today to get very precise confirmation of certain mathematical descriptions of the universe and how it's changed over cosmic time.
That is just a wow.
Yeah, I agree. It really is.
Your book discusses consciousness. Humans experience life subjectively, you say, but we fail to explain consciousness in a physical way. You suggest that one bold idea is that there could be innate mindfulness in a particle, that a swirl of mindful particles could create a conscious mind. Where is science on that now?
Yeah, well, that's a very speculative idea. I think it's an interesting one, worthy of contemplating. It comes from a number of individuals, but David Chalmers, I think, is the person who's most closely associated with that. And he is a very thoughtful, insightful philosopher. I think he began life as a physicist, and naturally, with that orientation, sought to understand how it could possibly be that particles, as we usually describe them in physics, which they don't have inner sensations, they have qualities, electric charge and mass and quantum mechanical spin, for example, but they don't have any inner emotion. They don't have any kind of proto thought that's within them. How could you take a large collection of those inside of a brain, configure them appropriately, hook them up to a source of energy, namely the rest of the body that takes in fuel from the environment, and then how could they possibly generate thought, emotion, qualitative sensations of the external world? And so he beat his head against that problem, which he coined the term the hard problem of consciousness that many people have struggled with. But he beat his head against the wall so hard that ultimately he said it can't be resolved. He said the only resolution is to rethink what the particles are. The particles must have some kind of little bit of inner life, a little bit of inner sensation. And somehow when they are in aggregate in the right configuration, those little bits of inner proto-consciousness hook up and yield the sense of consciousness that you and I are familiar with. But I would say that it's not at all a theory that science has yet embraced. To my mind, it just shows the extent to which people are willing to go to try to resolve this deep puzzle of how we have inner worlds of sight and sound and emotion. Where is the origin of those deeply human and deeply life-affirming sensations?
Your book has a section called Evolutionary Roots of Religion. What Darwinian utility could art and ritual have? What did our ancient relatives, why did they create cave art when that didn't help them find food?
Yeah, it is a puzzle, and it's one that Darwin himself thought about. Why would we as a species undertake behaviors that seem extraneous, extravagant, that seem to waste energy and not have a return that you could quantify in the sense of that got us more food, that got us better shelter, that advanced the survival of the species? Because evolution is very good at winnowing away extraneous behaviors. Because if you have a competitor who doesn't undertake the extraneous behavior, but uses their time more wisely, then in the battle for survival, ultimately they're going to have a slight advantage. And that slight advantage over a long period of time will mean they will win out and you'll go extinct. But we didn't go extinct. And so the question is, might there be evolutionary utility to some behaviors that are not so obvious? And for religion, one of the ideas that Darwin discussed and others have developed is religion may be the means by which our ancestors came together in groups that were not kin related. They were not blood related, and therefore they didn't have a significant shared gene pool, which would be one reason why you might protect your kin so that their genes, which are effectively your genes, would survive. But if you both, or if you all buy into the same religious system, that belief may bind you into a powerful group through your common allegiance. And that may make you better fighters and better able to protect each other. It's no longer just you and your kin, it's the entire group. And that may have aided survival among our ancestors. Others have thought of different evolutionary roles for religion. Going back to Ernest Becker and the idea of the denial of death, there's a whole group of social psychologists who've been developing something called terror management theory, kind of a big mouthful. But the idea is we as humans not only try to find strategies for denying our own mortality, but we go further in trying to develop things that allow us to succeed in light of that knowledge. And so religion may well have been the palliative. It may have been the means by which our ancestors were not frozen, as these authors describe it, quivering piles of protoplasm in the face of the ultimate terror of death, thinking that death is not the end. With religion, many religions suggest that death is a stepping stone. And if you buy into that perspective, you can well imagine it changes your attitude, allowing you to undertake activities that otherwise you might not have the wherewithal to carry through on because of your own terror, through your own recognition of your own mortality.
In your book, you say, quote, "My confidence in the existence of God is low because of the paucity of rigorous supporting data," unquote. In light of your serious doubts, I'm curious about your open-mindedness, that you don't completely discount the possibility of God. How do you reflect on that?
Well, a couple of things. First, we don't know, and so to come out and say that we do know that there's nothing beyond what we see and are aware of in the physical world, to me, that's a step too far. Now, if you were to press me, I would say if I had to make a commitment to one worldview or the other, my worldview certainly is one that does not need the existence of a deity. But that's different from saying that I am certain that there isn't one. And, perhaps you can say that I'm hedging my bets. I don't think you're there, but I'm willing to allow for it. So, when it comes to the moment, remember that, that sort of thing. But more seriously, I would say there are certainly some of my colleagues who would be all too happy if religion was simply wiped away. It was no longer part of human behavior, human discourse. Some of my colleagues view religion as a remnant of behaviors that were relevant in the infancy of the species, but now it's time to outgrow it all. And my view is that that's a very limited perspective because, sure, if you view religion as a means of explaining the external world, then clearly when a religion goes head to head with science, science wins. And then you'd say, okay, we should get rid of this alternative framework called religion. But I don't see religion that way. And I don't think many do see religion that way. I see religion as part of the journey to understand who we are, part of the inward directed journey, not the outward objective directed journey, the inward directed journey. And as part of guidance in that journey, for some people, it's a very powerful framework. There's this wonderful book by William James. Again, I don't think many people read it much these days. The Varieties of Religious Experience, based on lectures. Well, there we go. We're kindred spirits, clearly, Randall. So James wrote this book, as you know. There were lectures that he gave in Scotland at the turn of the last century, 1902 or so. And in there, he first of all shows how religion plays so many different roles in so many different lives, and it's expressed in so many different ways. So even to talk about religion as one thing is so coarse, number one. But number two, he describes religion as this means by which we can really experience the wonder of being alive. I mean, he uses beautiful language, to experience, the dawn of the sun, to experience the sublimity of the stars. And he describes how religion can get you to a place of emotional connection to the world that science is hard pressed to deliver. And in that guise, religion is very complementary to a scientific perspective. Use science to understand those third-party accessible, measurable, objective features of the world. And for some, use religion to help connect you in an emotional sense to who you are, where you came from, and what your life is about. And so I don't see them as necessarily in conflict, and I don't see the need to somehow rid the world from religion. It's not to say that that in the name of religion, some terrible things are done, but terrible things are done in the name of many things. And I think we need to look at the thing itself as opposed to those acts and features and events that may be done in its name.
I loved your wonderful metaphor of our sun as a grandchild of the universe's first generation of stars, our sun being a third generation star, that it took these generations of stars to cook the heavier elements like carbon and iron, the stuff of our bodies and the earth. Could you share a bit of that family story, if you will?
Yeah, sure. A deep question is, where do the stars come from? Where do planets come from? Where do people come from? And that's part of the cosmological narrative that I think people should understand and embrace, really, to get a sense of at least the physics of how it came to be that we're here. And so the Big Bang, a lot of energy. Exactly where that comes from, still mysterious, but we believe there was a lot of energy there that then was spewed outward as the universe expanded. That energy was transformed into particles over time. And those particles clustered together under the force of gravity. Gravity pulled the particles together into structures. In the early days of our universe, those structures were really big, some huge, enormous stars that were so energetic that they used up their nuclear fuel really quickly, exploded, and spewed out the other particles that were cooked in their interior while they were alive and cooking. Those particles spewed outward. And again, gravity pulls them together at some point into the next generation of stars. They cook even more complex nuclei in their cores. A core of a star is sort of like a nuclear furnace, crushes particles together into more complex forms. It then uses up its fuel, goes supernova, and spews those particles outward. And so the belief is, the data suggests that our sun is indeed a third generation star in that process, and that the planets, including the Earth, are just the kind of detritus of the particles that weren't brought into the sun as it formed. So the particles swirled around together, created the sun, and the excess stuff that was perhaps too far away to be pulled in, it fell together into smaller structures, the planets. And so that's all that we are. We are collections of stuff that was forged in stars, spewed outward, and collected under the force of gravity.
I only have two more questions, Professor Greene. What is the next big thing in cosmology?
I wish I knew. I'd be hard at work on it at the moment. But I would say the most exciting things that seem to be on the horizon, I'd say twofold. One, on the theoretical front, is using the ideas of quantum mechanics, gravity, string theory to perhaps really understand things like, as I mentioned before, what the nature of space, what the nature of time actually are. Could it be that time is not fundamental, but maybe it's an emerging quality of the universe? I mean by that is, for instance, we all know what temperature is. You know what it is when things are hot or cold. But as science progressed, we were able to give a deeper explanation for that. Things are hot when the molecules of that object are moving quickly. Things are cold when the molecules are moving slowly. So we found a molecular basis for this very intuitive idea of temperature. Is there an analogous story for time and for space? Are there atoms or molecules of time and space, and only when those ingredients are arranged correctly that you have conventional space and conventional time, but when they're not arranged in that manner, you've got some other mode of reality? I think we're heading in the direction of gaining insight into a question like that. On the observational front, I would say that gravitational waves, this beautiful success story over the course of 50 years, where scientists kept at it to try to detect these ripples in the fabric of space predicted by Einstein's mathematics and the general theory of relativity. The fact that they have been detected and continue to be detected gives us a new window on reality. It gives us a new way of examining the cosmos, not through light, which is basically all that we've done since the first of our brethren looked up into the sky. We only looked at the universe through the electromagnetic spectrum, through light. Now, in a sense, we can listen to it through these oscillations, these gravitational waves. And I can't help but think that in the coming decades or centuries, the insights that we'll gain from observing the universe in this completely different way, listening to it in this metaphorical stance, will give us powerful new insights.
Professor Greene, you finished writing your book on meaning before the pandemic. How has the pandemic affected your views on meaning in life?
It's really reinforced them. I mean, it could have been the case, I imagine, that I came out of this period with a radically different view of life, consciousness, myself, death. But everything that I've experienced, and it's been a rough ride. As I mentioned, we were protecting my elderly mother for many months, but nevertheless, she got the virus. It was a rough ride. And I come out the other side reaffirmed. Not that it was easy, but I feel a sense of affirmation that the ideas of thinking of human beings as connected to the universe through what we're made of and the laws that govern us, and the recognition that however painful this period has been, it's just collections of particles battling other collections of particles. It's a age-old drama that unfortunately welled up in a very difficult and tragic manner in the last year, but it's an age-old drama. And that does help me feel a sense of equanimity in the face of the tumult. So, I think of my mom and I think of her as a collection that existed for a period of time. And I'm so thankful that I had overlap with her for a great many years. And now she has been brought back into the cosmos in a very deep and profound manner that will happen to us all. And I do gain a sense of solace from that perspective.
Well, thank you for that. I'm coming out of the pandemic. All I want to do is see my kids. And from that perspective, it just doesn't matter if the universe is going to end or not.
Right. That's right. It focuses your attention on the here and now. Absolutely.
It's been such a great pleasure to be with you, Professor Greene. And we'll have to continue our conversation. We'd love to have you back in Houston.
I would enjoy that. And thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Look forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us, our worldwide audience. Be sure and get your book at the link and Brian Greene's signed commemorative bookplate. And we'll see you next time. Take care.